Now, there is something that men fear more than pain, and that's being forced to go through pain with no one who stays when it gets heavy. Most men can function while they're hurting. They can hold a job, raise kids, show up to court, manage bills, take care of their responsibilities while simultaneously dealing with internal stress. Men have a very high threshold for discomfort. What breaks trust is when a man needs support during a serious moment and the people who claim to care about him are nowhere to be found. That is the pivotal psychological event for men because it alters how they classify other people. They stop expecting consistency and begin expecting disappointment. And with that new expectation, they reorganize their behavior around that. That is not antisocial behavior. That is what rational adjustment looks like after observing repeated patterns. A lot of men, they go through a quiet shift, right? He starts replying less. He doesn't initiate contact as much. He doesn't keep conversations going out of obligation. He stops offering his internal life to people who have not demonstrated long-term reliability. There is no speech, no announcement, no meltdown. He simply corrects his exposure to relational risk. That's it. The correction is not dramatic. It is efficient. And then another shift takes place. The man realizes that silence isn't stressful. Other people's inconsistency was. That is the part that is misunderstood. Men aren't avoiding connection, they're avoiding instability. And Carl Jung's work is relevant here because he didn't glorify solitude. What he did was he used it as a controlled environment so that he could think without social interference. So he would step away from the crowd, not to isolate himself permanently, but to where he could see his beliefs clearly, separate from external pressure. Men do the same thing today, not to escape humanity, but to get their mental landscape organized without someone else's influence in the room. And some men are particularly impacted by this dynamic because of perceptiveness. There are men who pick up on power dynamics, on emotional tension and hidden motives and insincerity faster than others. Jung described these kinds of patients. They don't need long exposure to see what the social environment is actually doing. They see it immediately. Immediately. And this kind of perceptiveness makes groups uncomfortable. It does. It makes groups uncomfortable. And it's not because the perceptive man is hostile. It's that he notices things other people would prefer stay unexamined. And here's the thing about groups. They maintain their cohesion by agreeing silently on what everyone pretends not to see. When a man refuses to go along with that, he is not welcome deeper in the group. He is quietly moved further out. Not because he's broken, but because he disrupts the unwritten contract of selective blindness. When that happens enough times, a man sees a pattern. It is easier to think alone than to deal with the friction of constant social self-editing. This is when solitude becomes normal. And then something else becomes obvious. Men do not want a large circle. They want one reliable human being who does not retreat when life becomes difficult. That is the correct statement. Men don't want constant entertainment. They want stability. They don't want attention from strangers. They want follow through from one person who says they care and behaves like they care. They want them to mean it. And most men eventually discover that fewer and fewer people actually qualify for that role. And that realization changes how men behave for the rest of their lives. Men don't stop trusting because it's dramatic to do so. They stop trusting because the evidence supports that conclusion. When a man opens up during a serious moment and the person who claimed to care suddenly becomes scarce, that is enough data. That's enough. It teaches him something final. And that finality is that most people want proximity to strength, not responsibility when strength gets tested. From that point forward, men don't gamble. They don't offer vulnerability first. They don't disclose their internal process without observing behavior first. They stop assuming people are safe just because the person claims to be. This is how psychological barriers form in real time. Or I wouldn't say barriers, more like boundaries. And this produces a predictable result that people oftentimes misread. The man no longer depends on others emotionally. So therefore, they conclude that he's guarded or distant, and that's not what happened. He's not guarded or distant. He simply reorganized his internal architecture around what he can control. And he removed dependency on what historically failed him. That is not trauma response, that is proper calibration. Once a man becomes self-contained, people become more interested in him again. Because he doesn't require anything from them. And many men realize the attention that they get at that stage, it doesn't come from a place of loyalty. It comes from a place of opportunity. It's opportunistic. They realize that the same people who ignored them when they were hurting now want access to the version of them that no longer needs anything or anyone. And this reinforces his decision to remain cautious. And here is where Carl Jung's model returns. Individuation is when a man's identity stops being a social product and becomes internally authored. That is not disconnection. That is the completion of psychological adulthood. It means he is no longer available for superficial connection, and he's no longer impressed by group approval. And he is no longer manipulated by emotional pressure. He builds his life so that abandonment cannot destabilize him again. Now, he still welcomes connection with open arms, but he does not recruit it or chase it or beg for it. But here's the thing is he will only open up his arms if loyalty is earned. If someone demonstrates loyalty consistently, he does allow them in. But he measures their reliability with observable behavior, not sentiment. Like I said, men don't fear pain as much as they fear being obligated to trust people who will not remain steady when things stop being easy. So they choose a different foundation. Not because they rejected humanity, but because they finally created conditions where no one can jeopardize their psychological stability again. And that is the truth. Men don't build isolation out of hatred, they build isolation out of necessity. And until someone demonstrates loyalty with time and consistent behavior, solitude remains the environment where a man's inner world is safest. That isn't cynicism. That is the conclusion that emerges when a man's worldview is built from evidence, not wishful thinking. Men don't fear pain as much as they fear reliance on people who disappear when the pain arrives. So they construct a life where the pain is survivable, whether anyone stays or not.